Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into, well, a really big one, actually seed plants.
Big is an understatement, I'd say. I mean, just look around.
Exactly. They're everywhere. They're the foundation of pretty much every terrestrial ecosystem we know.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a landscape without them. And even when disaster strikes, like, say, the eruption of Mount St. Helens, remember that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The 1980 eruption.
Total devastation, you'd think. But seed plants, they're resilient, huh?
Incredibly. I mean, fireweed was already popping up all over the place practically before the ash had settled.
Talk about a comeback story. Right, so for this deep dive, I think what we really want to get into is how these plants managed to become so incredibly dominant on land. What adaptations made it possible for them to thrive in so many different environments, you know?
Yeah. Story about evolution, really. How did we go from algae in the water to, well, giant redwoods and delicate orchids?
Precisely. And luckily, we've got a whole chapter packed with theories, concepts, research findings, all the good stuff to help us unpack this.
Perfect. So let's talk about those key evolutionary innovations that allowed seed plants to conquer the land. We're talking reduced Gametophytes, Heterospory, ovules, pollen, and seeds.
Each one a game changer in its own right, and all intricately connected.
Right. Okay, so let's jump in with seeds and pollen, shall we?
Sounds good. I think to really appreciate seeds and pollen, we need to start with gametophytes. Now, as you know, the gametophyte is the stage in the plant life cycle where the sex cells, the sperm, and eggs are produced.
Right, like the plant's reproductive center, in a sense.
Exactly. And in the earlier plant groups, the mosses and ferns, those gametophytes are often independent, free-living, kind of exposed to the elements.
Vulnerable little things.
Vulnerable indeed. But seed plants, they do things a bit differently.
They seem to do everything a bit differently.
Right. Their gametophytes are microscopic, and here's the key. They develop within the tissues of the parent sporophyte.
So the sporophyte, which is the dominant, what we usually think of as the plant, is providing protection for the gametophyte.
Precisely. And not just protection. Think about it. It's a steady supply of nutrients, too. Makes a huge difference when you're facing the challenges of life on land.
Yeah, totally. I mean, intense UV radiation, drying out.
All those hazards. So this close relationship, sporophyte nurturing the gametophyte, it's a much more secure and efficient system. Figure 30.2 in the chapter shows this really nicely.
Okay, so that's reduced gametophytes. And then we have Heterospory.
Yeah, Heterospory. Think of it as a division of labor, a specialization of the sexes in the plant world.
Like separate teams for male and female reproduction.
Exactly. You have megasporangia producing megaspores, which then develop into female gametophytes, and microsporangia producing microspores, giving rise to the male gametophytes.
A bit more organized than just having one type of spore, I guess.
You bet. And it sets the stage for another innovation, the ovule.
Yeah.
Really crucial for protecting the female side of things.
The ovule. So this is where things get interesting.
Definitely. Some seedless plants also have heterospory, But what's unique to seed plants is that they keep that megasporangium tucked away safely inside the parent sporophyte. And then, for added protection, it gets enveloped by a layer of sporophyte tissue called the integument.
An extra layer of security.
Exactly, like a little fortress for the developing female gametophyte. Now, gymnosperms typically have one integument.
Makes sense.
Right. But the angiosperms, those flowering plants, they go for double the protection, 2 integuments. You can see it clearly in figure 30.3a. So the whole structure, the megasporangium, the megaspore inside, and that integument wrapping, that's our ovule. And inside this ovule, the female gametophyte is going to develop and produce one or more egg cells.
Okay, got it. So we've got the ovule as this sort of well-protected chamber for the female gametophyte. And on the male side, we have the microspores developing into pollen grains.
Bingo. And pollen grains, they're like tiny self-contained packages designed for travel. Each pollen grain contains the male gametophyte. And to protect it during its journey, it's got this tough outer wall made of sporopollenin.
Sporopollenin, is that stuff as tough as it sounds?
Oh, you bet. It's incredibly durable, helps the pollen survive all sorts of harsh conditions. And of course, we need a way to get the pollen to the ovule, which is where pollination comes in.
Makes sense. So what's remarkable here is that seed plants manage to break free from the need for water for fertilization. Unlike the mosses and ferns, they don't need those swimming sperm anymore.
Right. It was a huge evolutionary leap. Pollen can be carried by the wind or by animals directly to the ovule. No need for water.
Super efficient. And even the sperm themselves in most seed plants, they're not even motile, are they?
Nope. They get a direct delivery service, basically. The pollen grain lands on the ovule, germinates, and forms a pollen tube that grows right into the female gametophyte, carrying the sperm along.
Clever. Though I guess some plants still have those old school swimming sperm, right?
You're right. Some gymnosperms, like cycads and ginkgos, they still do. Kind of a throwback to their ancestors.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so we have this well-protected female gametophyte within the ovule and the male gametophyte all packaged up in pollen, delivering the sperm, and then after fertilization, we get the seed.
Precisely. And seeds, they're just remarkable. They offer so many advantages over spores, which was how those earlier plant groups like ferns dispersed. Think about it. A spore is usually just a single cell. Pretty fragile, limited lifespan. A seed, though, it's multicellular, it's got the embryo inside, a food supply, all packaged up in a tough seed coat like you see in figure 30.3c.
Built for survival.
Absolutely. Seeds can withstand harsh conditions, they can stay dormant for ages, waiting for the right time to germinate, and they can travel long distances to new habitats.
I remember reading about those ancient date palm seeds they found near the Dead Sea. Amazing.
Isn't it incredible? They were something like 2,000 years old, and some even germinated. They used carbon-14 dating, a clever technique to figure out their age. You know, carbon-14, it's a radioactive isotope, and by measuring how much of it is left in a sample, they can estimate how long ago it was part of a living organism.
2,000 years. That's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So just to summarize what we've covered so far, seed plants have these 5 crucial adaptations. The reduced gametophytes, Heterospory, ovules, pollen, and the seeds themselves. And it's clear how each of these features played a big role in their success on land.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so now let's dive into the gymnosperms, the plants with those naked seeds.
Naked because their seeds are exposed, usually on those cone-like structures. Conifers, the pine trees, firs, redwoods, those are the most familiar gymnosperms. Figure 30.4 shows you the life cycle of a pine, which is a pretty good representative of the group.
Okay, so the pine tree itself, the one we see, that's the sporophyte. And the cones are where all the action happens.
Exactly. Now, most conifers are heterosporous, so they've got 2 types of cones, pollen cones and ovulate cones. Pollen cones are pretty straightforward. They've got these scales, which are actually modified leaves called microsporophylls. And on the underside of each microsporophyll, you've got microsporangia, where those microspores are produced. Those microspores then develop into the pollen grains.
And they produce tons of pollen, don't they? Those yellow clouds of pollen in the spring.
That's right. It's all about getting those pollen grains out there, hoping they'll land in the right place. Now, the ovulate cones, they're a bit more complex. They've got these scales too, but they're compound scales, like reduced branches, really. Each scale has a megasporophyll, which bears the megasporangium, and some stem tissue. And inside that megasporangium, a megasporocyte goes through meiosis, producing 4 megaspores. But usually only one survives, and that lucky one becomes the female gametophyte, sitting there inside the megasporangium.
A lot going on inside those cones. So how does the pollen actually get to the ovule?
Well, in pines, it's all about the wind. A pollen grain just has to be lucky enough to land near the micropyle. That's a tiny little opening in the integument of the ovule. If it lands there, it can germinate and start forming a pollen tube, which then grows through the tissue of the megasporangium towards the female gametophyte. But here's the interesting thing. Fertilization doesn't happen immediately.
Really?
Yeah, in pines, it can take over a year from the time that pollen grain lands until fertilization actually occurs.
That's quite a wait.
It is. But eventually, the pollen tube reaches the female gametophyte, delivers the sperm, and fertilization happens.
So then the fertilized ovule starts to develop into a seed.
Right. The zygote divides and develops into the embryo, the tissue around it becomes the food supply, and the integument hardens up into the seed coat. Then the scales of the cone open up and out come the seeds, ready for dispersal.
Amazing how it all comes together. So gymnosperms, they weren't always the dominant plant group, were they?
Nope. We can trace some of their features back to the late Devonian, but the earliest fossils of true seed plants, plants that actually had seeds, they're from the genus Elkinsia, from about 360 million years ago.
Kinsia. So that's even before the dinosaurs, right?
Way before. See, during the Carboniferous, the climate was pretty warm and humid, and those seedless vascular plants, they were doing great. But then the Permian came along and things started to dry out.
Not so good for those water-loving plants.
Right. And that's when the gymnosperms, with their seeds and pollen, they really started to take over. They were well suited for those drier conditions. Some of them even evolved those needle-like leaves to reduce water loss.
Adapt or die.
Pretty much. And they stayed dominant for a long time, through the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs.
Wow, so they provided food and habitat for the dinosaurs.
Exactly. And there's even evidence from fossils, like the one in figure 30.6, that shows that some gymnosperms were being pollinated by insects back then.
Really? So they had help from insects, even way back then. So even though they're not as dominant today with the rise of flowering plants, gymnosperms are still an important group.
Oh, absolutely. Just think of the coniferous forests that cover huge areas of the planet. And there's quite a variety of them, too. We have four main groups: the cycads, the ginkgos, the Gametophytes, and the conifers.
Let's run through those quickly. What about cycads?
Well, they kind of look like palm trees with those big cones, and they still have those swimming sperm, which is interesting. But sadly, they're endangered now.
That's a shame. And ginkgos. There's just the one species left, isn't there?
Yeah, Ginkgo biloba, the maidenhair tree, also a swimming sperm. It's a tough tree, though. Tolerates pollution really well.
I've seen them planted in cities.
Exactly. They do well there. And then we've got the Gametophytes.
Gametophytes. Always a strange one, that name.
They're a bit of a mixed bag, those Gametophytes. Three main genera: Netum, Ephedra, and Welwitschia. Each one looks completely different from the others. Ephedra, also called Mormon tea, grows in dry places, and it produces ephedrine, which is used in medicine. And then you've got Welwitschia, which is this bizarre plant from the Namib Desert.
Oh, yeah. Welwitschia with those two huge leaves that just keep growing. Crazy.
Crazy is a good word for it. And finally, we have the conifers, the biggest group of gymnosperms.
The ones we all know and love.
Pines, firs, spruces, cedars, redwoods, mostly evergreen with those needle-like or scale-like leaves, and they make up those huge forests in the north.
Yeah, absolutely essential ecosystems. Okay, let's move on to the angiosperms, the flowering plants.
Now we're talking. Angiosperms, they're the most diverse group of plants on Earth, over 290,000 species, and they're everywhere. And their big innovations, of course, are flowers and fruits.
Which kind of define our world when you think about it.
They really do. So the flower, it's essentially a specialized shoot for sexual reproduction. Like you can see in figure 30.8, it's got up to 4 types of modified leaves arranged in whorls: sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels.
The classic flower structure.
Right. Sepals, they're usually green and they protect the flower bud. Petals, they're the showy ones, attracting pollinators.
Though wind-pollinated flowers, like grasses, they don't need showy petals, do they?
Nope. No need to attract insects if the wind is doing the work.
Smart. Okay, and then the stamens and carpels, those are the important reproductive parts, right?
Those are the ones that matter, yeah. So stamens, they're the male parts. They produce the pollen. Each stamen has a filament, the stalk, and an anther at the top where the pollen is made. And then the carpels, they're the female parts. They have a stigma, which is sticky to catch the pollen, a style leading down, and an ovary at the base containing the ovules.
So that ovary is what develops into the fruit, right?
You got it. And sometimes several carpels can be fused together, and that's called a pistil. Now, flowers can be radially symmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical. Figure 30.9 has good examples of both.
Yeah, I always think of orchids when I think of bilateral symmetry. Just one line is
Well, that's correctly. And there's some interesting research that suggests that bilateral symmetry might actually lead to more speciation, like in figure 30.15, maybe because it helps with more precise pollen placement on pollinators.
So the shape of the flower can actually influence evolution.
It seems so, yeah. It's fascinating. So after the flower does its thing, we get the development of the fruit, which comes from the ovary, as you mentioned.
A fruit is essentially a mature ovary.
That's it, like a pea pod, for example. The pod is the fruit, and the peas are the seeds. Fruits protect the seeds, and they also help with dispersal, getting those seeds out to new places.
And there's such a huge variety of fruits, from fleshy ones to dry ones.
Tons of variation. You can see some examples in figure 30.10. Fleshy fruits, like tomatoes, have that juicy, often colorful flesh, while dry fruits, like nuts, have a dry pericarp, the fruit wall. Some dry fruits split open, some stay closed, and then you have things like grains, which are actually fruits too, but the fruit wall is fused to the seed coat.
Always forget the grains are fruits. Okay, so once we have the fruits, they need to get dispersed, and plants have some pretty ingenious ways of doing that.
It's amazing the diversity of dispersal mechanisms. Wind dispersal, like dandelions or maples with their winged seeds. Water dispersal, like coconuts designed to float. And then, of course, animal dispersal, which is super common.
Hitching a ride on a furry friend.
Yeah, some have burrs that stick to fur. Others have tasty fruits that animals eat and then poop out the seeds somewhere else. Figure 30.11 shows you some of those different mechanisms.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's talk about the angiosperm life cycle itself. Figure 30.12 lays it all out. And they had this unique process called double fertilization, right?
Yes, double fertilization, a key angiosperm feature. So within the anther, microsporocytes undergo meiosis to produce microspores, which become pollen grains. Each pollen grain has a generative cell that will make the sperm and a tube cell for the pollen tube. And then in the ovule, the megasporocyte goes through meiosis, producing 4 megaspores. Usually only one survives, and it develops into the female gametophyte, also called the embryo sac.
Okay, lots of steps.
It is a bit complex. So then pollination happens. The pollen lands on the stigma, germinates, and sends down that pollen tube through the style, heading for the ovary. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule, it releases those 2 sperm cells into the embryo sac. And here's where the double fertilization magic happens.
The moment of truth.
One sperm fertilizes the egg cell, making the zygote, and the other sperm, it fuses with those 2 polar nuclei in the central cell of the embryo sac, forming a triploid cell.
Triploid, meaning it has 3 sets of chromosomes, right?
Exactly. And that triploid cell becomes the endosperm, the food supply for the developing embryo.
A 2-for-1 deal. So why do you think double fertilization evolved?
Well, the prevailing idea is that it helps to synchronize things. You don't want to waste resources making food for an embryo that hasn't actually been fertilized. Double fertilization ensures that the endosperm only develops if there's a fertilized egg.
Makes sense. So then, after double fertilization, the ovule develops into the seed, with the embryo, endosperm, and seed coat, and the ovary becomes the fruit. And if everything goes well, that seed will eventually germinate and grow into a new sporophyte plant. Now, let's talk about angiosperm evolution, which puzzled Darwin quite a bit. He called it an abominable mystery.
Yeah, he couldn't figure out why angiosperms seemed to appear so suddenly in the fossil record. Back then, the evidence suggested they popped up around 100 million years ago, seemingly out of nowhere.
Like they just materialized.
But our understanding of that has changed, hasn't it? It has. Thanks to more recent discoveries and techniques like molecular clock analysis, we now think that angiosperms probably originated earlier, in the early Cretaceous, maybe around 140 million years ago. We found fossil pollen from about 130 million years ago, and even fossils of early angiosperms like Archifructus and Leafructus from around 125 million years ago.
Pushing the timeline back.
Exactly. So it wasn't quite as abrupt as Darwin thought, more like a 20 to 30 million year period of diversification.
And what do we think those early angiosperms were like?
It's still a bit of a debate. Archifructus was herbaceous and might have lived in water, so some think the earliest angiosperms were aquatic, but others point to evidence from extinct seed plants related to angiosperms, like the bennetales, that suggests they might have been woody.
A bit of a mystery still.
True. And they probably had small, simple flowers, maybe not as efficient at water transport as some modern angiosperms. Now, how are all these different angiosperms related to each other?
Yeah, what does the family tree look like?
Figure 30.14b shows a simplified version of the phylogeny, the evolutionary relationships. At the base, we've got those basal angiosperms, like Amberella, water lilies, and the star anise group. Then we have the magnolides, like magnolias and avocados. And then the 2 big groups, the monocots and the eudicots.
The ones that dominate today.
Right. And it's worth noting that some of those early lineages, like Amberella, lack those specialized water-conducting cells called vessel elements, suggesting they evolved later.
Fascinating. And of course, we can't forget the animals. They played such a huge role in shaping angiosperm evolution, haven't they?
Totally. It's a story of coevolution, really. Plants and animals influencing each other's evolution. Herbivores put pressure on plants to evolve defenses like thorns or toxins, and then you have those mutually beneficial relationships, especially with pollinators.
Flowers and their pollinators, it's an incredible story.
It is. Flowers have evolved all sorts of ways to attract specific pollinators, which then helps with efficient pollination and can lead to more new species forming.
It goes back to that idea we talked about earlier, that flower shape can actually influence evolution. Okay, so now we have this incredible diversity of angiosperms, the monocots and the eudicots being the 2 big groups. Figure 30.16 compares their characteristics. So what are the main differences between them?
Well, monocots, their embryos have 1 cotyledon, the seed leaf. Their leaves usually have parallel veins. Their stem vascular tissue is scattered. They have fibrous roots. Their pollen grains have 1 pore, and their flower parts are in multiples of 3.
Okay, so orchids, grasses, palms, those are monocots. Got it.
Exactly. And eudicots, they have 2 cotyledons. net-like leaf veins, stem vascular tissue in a ring, a taproot system, pollen grains with 3 pores, and flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5.
And that group includes most of the familiar flowering plants like beans, roses, and oaks.
Right. And then, of course, there are those basal angiosperms and magnolids that we talked about, with some characteristics of both.
It's just mind-boggling how much diversity has evolved from those early angiosperm lineages.
Okay.
Okay, let's wrap up with section 30.4, which is all about how we humans depend on seed plants.
It's a good reminder of how crucial they are to our survival and well-being. I mean, just think about food. Most of the calories we consume come directly or indirectly from seed plants.
They're the base of the food chain, really.
Right. Staple crops like maize, rice, wheat, potatoes, cassava, they provide the bulk of our calories. And even the livestock we eat, they're mostly fed with seed plants.
We'd be in trouble without them.
Oh.
And not just food, right? They provide fuel, building materials, medicines.
Exactly. Wood is still a major source of fuel in many parts of the world. And it's also a crucial building material. And then there's the long history of using seed plants for medicinal purposes. Traditional herbal remedies and modern medicines derive from plants.
I remember reading that something like 25% of prescription drugs in the U.S. have ingredients originally derived from plants.
It's a staggering number. And aspirin, a classic example, it comes from willow bark, which has been used for pain relief for centuries.
Yeah, amazing stuff. So from food to medicine to shelter, we rely on seed plants in countless ways, which makes those threats to plant diversity, like deforestation, all the more concerning.
It's a huge issue. We're losing plant species at an alarming rate. And that's not only bad for biodiversity, it also has implications for us.
We need to protect these incredible plants. It's in our own best interest. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the evolution of seeds to the diversity of angiosperms to the importance of seed plants to humanity. It's been a fascinating journey.
I agree. It's been a great deep dive.
And as always, we want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. We've talked about how crucial seed plants are, but we haven't really talked about what we can do to protect them. So what actions can we take, both individually and as a society, to conserve plant diversity for future generations? Just a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Until next time.
See you then.